So, welcome back to The London Architect. This is episode 4, I think. And today we have Stephen Davies with us from 3144 Architects. Welcome, Stephen. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for asking me to join.
So, 31, is it 31 out of 44? 3144?
It's 31/44.
Okay, is that how you say it?
No, 3144 or 3144 is it's fine with us.
Okay, and there's a little backstory behind that name, isn't there?
Yeah, so the practice was founded by my business partner, Will, and at the time, a third partner called James. And the reason for the 3144 name was that the guys at the time, and I share the same kind of opinion, nobody wanted to put their name above the door. We kind of a studio that was inclusive, and we'd all kind of worked at practices where you get to a point, and if it isn't one of the name directors turning up to a project, people ask where they are. So James, at the time, had been doing a little bit of work with Will, and had moved to Amsterdam because his wife was from Amsterdam. And obviously we had the London studio. So the idea was to take the dialing codes for the Netherlands and the UK.
Yeah.
31/44. And yeah, since then I joined the practice not long after. And we've been going now about 12 years, I think.
Nice. So before you were at 3144, you worked for Proctor Matthews?
That's right, yeah. I worked with Proctor Matthews Architects, and so did James and Will, and that's where we all met.
Okay.
And Proctor Matthews are a design-led studio, and they're based in kind of around London Bridge area. And we all worked there at the same time. I think I worked there for about 7 or 8 years.
Okay. And had you come straight... What were you doing before that?
First job after university was I was working in Manchester.
Right.
So I did my degree in Liverpool.
Yeah.
And then I did my diploma in Manchester.
Okay.
And in between doing the degree and the diploma, you do a year placement in practice.
Yeah.
So I'd gone over to Manchester to do that, enjoyed my year there, and thought I'd, like to stay, and did my diploma there rather than returning to Liverpool. And then after that, I went back to the same practice that I was working for and worked for another 2 years. Kind of really enjoyed both of those cities at the time. It was 97 to 2000, I think, in Liverpool, and then 2000 to 2005 in Manchester.
So at what point was London sort of on the horizon for you?
I suppose it wasn't until I'd worked in Manchester for a few years, and I'd then got my, professional qualifications, and you start to think, well, where are the opportunities and where are the things that you want to challenge yourself with? And that was all pointing really towards London.
Okay.
I mean, there's a lot of architects in this town.
Yeah, indeed. Are there any sort of architectural periods of sort of like in modern history of a city, perhaps in Europe, that are of interest to you that you wish you could have sort of, I know it's a bit of a difficult question, but from an architect's perspective.
Yeah, if Will was here, he could give you a very good answer to that, I'm sure.
I'll get him on next.
But I think it's interesting because, for a number of reasons, whether it's a growth of a city over a small period of time that you would be part of.
Yeah.
I mean, for me, obviously not in Europe, but New York or somewhere like that, kind of its explosion and its growth is kind of very alluring and kind of like, wow, wouldn't it have been amazing to have been in town when that was all going on? And the same with cities, like Venice and Paris and places like that. And, it's really interesting to kind of go and look at those periods of explosion and growth and how things happened and why.
I remember you speaking about this in our pre-meet chat about sort of the narrative, the practicality, the justification, all these different things you have to consider. Could you sort of elaborate a little bit on those kind of finer aspects of it?
Yeah, I think So as architects and designers, you're looking backwards
Yeah.
to inform what you're going to do going forwards.
Of course.
And it's really interesting because there are a number of things that you start to uncover, and it becomes very logical just through, historic research, understanding an area, through understanding a building even, taking that building apart and thinking, well, why was it done the way it was? And why was this neighborhood built the way it was? And what happened here, especially in cities, through damage through war or kind of change in a kind of a government or parliamentary direction to say, well, we're going to kind of rehouse people in a certain way, and big sweeps happen through our urban fabric. And then you're thinking, well, these pockets were left and they're giving us kind of glimpses, or we have to piece this together.
Yeah.
And we find that fascinating, and we find it a really, really critical part of design.
Sort of like detective work.
A little, yeah, I suppose, yeah.
And then going forward, do you feel as if you sort of become part of that storytelling process with your designs?
Yeah, you do. So we will take a precedent from, we'll have a project and we'll have a site and we'll be working through it and we'll be looking at its immediate context. And then we'll be able to bring a precedent from something completely out of context on the face of it. Yeah. But it's because we've been led to a point that, actually now this thing here, this building here in a different part of the world or a different part of the country is relevant to us.
You can justify it.
Yeah, it becomes relevant to kind of to explore it.
Yeah, I noticed with Red Church Townhouse, one of your projects you said you were particularly proud of, that it's quite an industrial build, isn't it? But it's quite comfortable in its surroundings. And I wanted to ask, is that something that you think is important personally, or was that more of a planning sort of element?
I think it's definitely important to us as a studio, and me as an architect. I think it's critical. I think what you do when you take a project, so taking the townhouse, that's split into two phases. So it's a project that's in an area of London called Shoreditch, and it's on Red Church Street. And the first phase was a small, like 1960s, I think, industrial building.
Yeah.
That was a coffee roastery building. And our client bought the building with the intention to redevelop it. But before its 1960s version of itself, before that, it was a row of houses. And I think from memory, there would have been weavers' cottages, because a lot of weavers' cottages around that neck of the woods. And so if you imagine, they're kind of those kind of thin, tall houses, maybe with a room at the top for working in where the light would be coming in. And they were demolished, possibly through bomb damage during the war or clearance. And the little industrial building was built in its place. So when we took the project on, we're kind of looking at it thinking, well, obviously the history of this area is rich, and there are a lot of things going on. You've got the Georgian buildings looking down one street with their flat facades, and then you turn the corner and you've got the Victorian buildings on the other street. So it's kind of, there's lots of opportunity to start developing answers to questions in the design. And that's, for us, that's our starting point. And then we start to look at a design, look at iterations of that. And then the point that you raised about, well, is it responding to the planning department or the kind of, the process of getting planning? It kind of goes hand in hand, because you develop your narrative and you develop your information that when you then present that at a meeting to the local authority, you've got strong justification for the proposal that you're putting forward. So for us, it's always rewarding when you get into that position where there's full conviction on what's happening with a project.
Yeah. Would you say that your work kind of you were speaking a lot about the different period houses when you first started doing these projects and what you were taking into consideration, does your work ever sort of follow you outside of working hours? And I mean, I don't know if you watch any particular documentaries on like the BBC, or any sort of fictional like series, and do you ever notice that, or does it kind of feed into that brainstorming process?
I think it never, sadly, well, good and bad, but being an architect or being a designer, you never switch off. It's 24/7.
Yeah.
And that's not a criticism. That's just a state of mind, because you're always looking at things and always thinking about things and trying to understand them. As a designer and someone practicing architecture, I've since kind of come to realize that I'm a kind of kinesthetic learner. And so actually doing is what I enjoy and where the learning happens.
It's funny that you mentioned sort of the doing side of it, because I remember you saying before about how you've been involved in some sort of like 3D modelling with your like teaching, is it, within your practice, where you get like cardboard and that it's refreshing to kind of go back to the basics almost?
But just model making, just physical model making. And it's a big part of the studio. We wish we could do it more, but it's time consuming, and therefore you have to weigh that up against money, sadly, and fees, and how much commitment you can give to doing that sort of research and development on a project. We have different computer packages now, and people will hear about things like BIM and Revit and these other kind of ways in which we can start to understand things three-dimensionally in a computer package. But a physical model it's so valuable in the design process. I think I was quite lucky in my education that when I went to university, everything was drawn by hand. And through doing a degree, everything was drawn on a drawing board. And you had these big sheets of this really kind of thick tracing paper, and you drew with pens, or you kind of experimented with other kind of ways of producing an image. Maybe it was a photo collage, and we had film on cameras, and you had to go and get it developed, and it was like, got 36 pictures here, and I hope I got 5 good ones out of this, otherwise that's another £5 and another day I'm going to have to sort this out for. And that was the first part. And then I worked, and it was CAD, computer aided design, was starting on computers. And you went into practice and you were taught how to use that. And I was given a fairly strict education in kind of line weights and did drawing and text, but it was all the same principles as what you'd have done if you're doing it by hand. And then coming through my education, obviously computers, the speed of technology was happening faster and faster.
I remember you mentioning before about sort of trying to maintain the ethos of a build, and I think you used like an analogy of a car, maybe it was. How difficult is it to kind of channel your ideas about the ethos of a build through those different stages, whether it be using technology or...
We design through an iterative process. We kind of think about something, get a strategy together, develop that early stage, and then kind of want to kind of go step by step to test, and then come back and test again. But we're not producing 40 options, and we're not working till 6 a.m. working on 40 options to then just show you that we've done lots of work.
So it doesn't make sense.
No, because I think that's when I gave the example of, say, a car. And some cars have been refined and refined and refined through decades and decades. And, a Porsche 911 is a good example. It continues to be refined. The technology is attaching itself to that design because things are changing through safety measures and so on, and fuel consumption and different things. I don't drive, by the way, so I have no idea about how cars work. But as a piece of design, that's fascinating. And looking at it as an architect and just looking at it in that terminology, for us, that's a kind of a good precedent, a good influence. Other people might choose to do something radical every time. They say, well, we did this and we've we've done that now, so we don't want to do it again.
Mhm.
We're going to go off and do this and turn the page completely.
Yeah. Do you find that sort of compliance issues kind of get in the way of design?
Yeah, no. I don't think they do. I don't think compliance gets in the way of design. I think design is, we solve problems.
Okay.
You know, that's what we're doing. We're
That's the whole
solving
point,
problems.
yeah.
And certain things that were not a problem yesterday in our environment, our built environment, are a problem today.
Mhm.
And we need to solve those problems for tomorrow.
How many people do you have at 3144?
Yeah, so our studio is, there's 8 of us in the team.
Okay.
And so it's in the world of architecture, that's a kind of a larger small office.
Mhm.
If you have 20 people in practice, that's considered a medium-sized office.
Okay. Is it like the Goldilocks of practices?
It's interesting, size of business
Mhm.
and size of studio compared to the work and the freedom that you have to do what you want to do. As part of my architectural education, there was very, very little to do with running a business.
Mhm.
There's very little to do with anything other than the design of architecture. So then to be running a business and running a practice, you have to learn a lot quite quickly.
Mhm.
And what you have to do is understand what you're good at and what you're not very good at. And then you work as a team.
Yeah.
And I find it fascinating to read about other practices, other businesses, and how they've grown
Mhm.
or how they've chosen to stay small because maybe that's the perfect size. So I think it's always a kind of matter of, well, sooner or later you start to find what works for you
Mhm.
as a practicing architect or designer. Some people want to stay very hands-on.
Mhm.
And therefore the studio is always going to stay quite small. And then some people are, wanting to grow a studio and, be able to have a bigger reach and reach those larger kind of projects, I suppose. It's interesting. I don't know the answer to where the sweet spot is or where the magic is and so on.
I guess ultimately it comes down to you as a person. Some people prefer to kind of work more independently and others feel like they thrive in more of a social environment.
Yeah. I think for me, being part of a team is absolutely critical. You can't, I don't know how you gather the traction to make anything happen if you're on your own. And the wider team. So in our studio, with 8 of us, we're working on projects. So Will and I are always involved in all the projects. And then people in the studio are running projects. So we kind of come in and work with them and kind of start projects up. And so it's fluid. Going back to what you said earlier, whereby, do you what happens when you're not in the office or in the studio? And it's like, it's still architecture. Still thinking about architecture. Go away on holiday and still end up in a building.
It's just part of you.
Yeah. Luckily, I have a very...
You can't escape it.
Yeah. Well, Laura, my wife, is also very passionate about design, and so it's lucky for us that we tend to end up in museums or industrial estates in certain parts of Europe to seek out new and interesting things that we may have heard about. So, but I think that's kind of, again, you're inquisitive.
It's great that you and Laura can sort of bounce ideas off of each other.
Yeah, we've undertaken a self-build project before, which was kind of brilliant.
Was that number 49?
Yeah. So
I wanted to ask about that.
So that was a self-build project that we did about 7 or 8 years ago, maybe a little longer now. And it was kind of, again, really interesting process to have. So Laura studied a degree in architecture, but then did a master's in art history. So she's moved away from the field of architecture, but is very much interested in design and works for a global company now, but in education and their learning team. But is incredibly passionate about design and kind of going through that process of designing the house and then obviously building the house. it's really interesting, again, going back to the skill sets that you have and who does what. And communication is everything. As soon as you can get that message across, and as soon as you can then visualize it, you're kind of making, there's momentum.
And that house won an RIBA award.
It did, yeah, it did. It was awarded it was awarded an RIBA regional award, a national award, London Small Project Award.
Is that the only project that you and Laura have worked on together?
Well, that was our self-build project, our own home.
Right.
We're currently in the process of undertaking this crazy madness of a self-build project again.
Stephen, I could go on and keep asking you loads of questions, but we're running out of time, and I have to ask you a question that our last guest has suggested. And that is, do you envisage a time in the future where architects become near obsolete? It's pretty depressing.
No.
No? And do you think that in any way the industry would need to future-proof itself?
Well, it's a big question.
Yeah.
I think that history will tell us that the future architect will be different to yesterday's architect.
Mm-hmm.
And, previously the role of the architect included a number of other areas. And now the role of the architect has changed from what it was 20 years ago, what it was 40 years ago.
Yeah.
The idea of the architect as the master builder, by definition, is kind of changing because we have more people involved in a team now. Mm-hmm. So we have a construction team. And so our role is going to change. There's no way it would become obsolete.
Yeah.
You have your specialist areas, and those areas will become more and more specialist.
Mm-hmm.
But we'll still need the glue to stick it all together.
Like the communication, like you said.
Exactly. And if you kind of, to say we're kind of head of the orchestra or something, is probably quite grand. But I think that's what it is. So no, we'll still be hanging around, I think.
Yeah. ChatGPT won't be doing any designs for a while. Great. Well, this has been excellent. Thank you so much, Stephen, for joining us. We've spoken about a lot. I really enjoyed the sort of philosophical design philosophy side of it. I hope you've enjoyed joining us.
It was very, very good to kind of stop for a minute and have a chat about what's going on in the world of architecture.
Yeah.
So thank you very much.
Definitely. Well, and thank you to all of our listeners for tuning in. Please leave any comments with positive or negative feedback. We welcome it all. And we'll see you on next week's episode of The London Architect.